call, and slightly indulgent to be talking about something that I am quite passionate about. So yeah. And actually, just to say, I think we're going to take about half an hour, aren't we, Damion? I noticed a note from Martin. So Martin, don't worry, we'll be hopefully finished by the time you have to get off the call. So yeah, it's just good to be here, really.
Thanks, Liz. So so we are going to be talking about metaphor, and just some ideas around how we might, I suppose, not just become aware of, tune into our client's metaphor, but also how we might work with them as they arise in the conversation, or perhaps we're being more directive and in introducing a metaphor to help the coachee explore their situation. So we thought, as a way of helping you arrive, it'd just be great to invite you to reflect on a question. And so the question I have for you is, if you were to use a metaphor to describe your years so far, what would you say? And please add that to the chat panel. So if you were to use a metaphor to describe your years so far, what would you say? So it'd just be wonderful to see some reflections from that question in the chat panel. Thank you, Ruth. So I can see roller coaster.
Learning curve.
Yeah. Peaks and valleys from Norway. Yeah, there's some lovely things coming through there.
I loved the jar of Marmite. Very evocative.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, lovely, aren't they?
Well, it's just pausing and seeing the impacts they have as well. So Liz, let's just start, because while these are coming through, and we can sort of see there the language that's being used.
Yeah.
I suppose it's a question coaches are aware of, but what's the importance of exploring, would you say, the coachee's language?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, metaphor is just one way in which we express ourselves. It's one part of the language we use. And I mean, on our programs, we explore the way that we take in information. And if you like, the different filters that we apply as we take in information. So those who have been on one of our programs will know we use sort of Chris Sagiris's ladder of inference as a way of thinking about this. The fact that we select the data, because we're bombarded with millions of pieces of data every day, our brain has to filter it. And so we tend to filter it based on our experience, our memories, our beliefs, and our values. And then, of course, we start to make assumptions, we start to make meaning, we draw conclusions. And we use all of that then to update our internal database of memories and beliefs and values. And so if it's going on that way, in other words, as the information comes into us, if you flip it, so we're also filtering as we're then sharing that back again with the outside world. And of course, we do that through our language. And so I suppose metaphor is a way of just sort of us putting a filter on the experience that we're having internally. And I mean, if you think about the brain as a system, you know, when you start looking at the numbers associated with the brain, you know, the trillions of synapses and the trillions of connections that are going off, you know, the numbers are quite hard to get your head around. It's almost like looking into the universe. And so if you like, in using language, our brain is trying to provide us with shortcuts of trying to convey an extraordinary amount of meaning that's held in our brain, but in a way we can't find enough words to convey it. And so using things like a metaphor is really almost like a shortcut for us in trying to convey some kind of meaning. And so underneath it, there's this rich, if you like, tapestry of meaning trying to come out. So it's almost like, as you said, this reverse filtering that we do. So whether it's metaphor or whether it's patterns of language, as a coach, it's really it's just good to get really curious and interested in the language that our coachees are using.
And because we're using the term metaphor, Liz, perhaps just say a bit more about specifically the importance of that. You've touched on it already, but what do we mean by metaphor?
Yeah, so actually a way of thinking about this is around sort of levels of thinking. And we've touched on a model of it, which is Chrysagoras, but this is another way of thinking about it. And it's taken from the work of Penny Tompkins and James Lawley. And they worked a lot with David Grove, and David Grove is the person who worked a lot with metaphor and clean language. So this is where it's sort of coming from. And they talk about different levels of thinking. So the first one is sort of the thinking that we do when we perceive things around us. I see, I hear things, I have that sense of feeling, and it might be internal and external. And then there's another layer of thinking, which is conceptual, which is what happens when we've processed some information and we've either made a judgment, I didn't do that very well, or we've offered an explanation, that was because, or we've made a decision. But Penny Tompkins and James Lawley make the point that that can't explain all of the complex thinking that we do. And so much more is going on a deeper, more fundamental level. And that's what they would describe as this metaphorical thinking. And if you like, and we'll come on to what a metaphor is, but metaphorical thinking is almost, it's like a set of internal stories that we create in order to make sense of the world. So that's why we talk about almost a metaphorical landscape. And, it is this sort of rich, I've used the word tapestry already. It is a tapestry of experience and memory and sense making woven together over time. And so if you think about it, it's sort of rich with the pattern and texture of our lives. And what's important about it, we talk about transformational coaching. And so by working at this deeper level, which is often unconscious, we're really encouraging that embodied shift in energy and in sense making. And a lot of NLP also draws on this kind of exploration. And there's a phrase from NLP, which is, take an experience, find its structure. And if you can change the structure, you change the experience. And that's some of the thinking around working with metaphors, that actually if we can help someone explore it in the moment, allowing them time for that to shift will also shift their relationship to whatever it is they're thinking about, or shift the meaning of it. So we'll just jump back. Thank you, Damion. So in terms of what a metaphor is, so metaphor, if there are any classicists on the call, I apologize, because there might be someone in the audience who knows more about Greek and Latin and sort of language roots than I do. My understanding is that actually it comes from the Greek word metapherin, which means to carry something across or transfer. And interestingly, that comes from a root word which is amphora, which is a beautiful Greek urn that has a pointed tip. And so it's designed that it cannot be put down except when there is a special container to put it in to keep it upright. And amphoras were used to transfer precious oils and perfumes and precious liquid. And they were designed that way, so they couldn't just be put down anywhere. So metaphor literally means to transfer meaning. So if you think of it in terms of our brains or our sense making, it's to transfer across from one part of our brain, often what we might describe the right side, the sort of creative place that creates patterns and emotion and holds all our memory, to the left side, which is where language is, to enable us to transfer it or carry it out to the outside so that we can share it. So and I think that's a lovely way of thinking about metaphor. It's the transfer of meaning from inside my head, my body, to outside so I can share it. And it really does contain those symbols of the unconscious mind. So they are a way of understanding something in terms of another. So hence some of the ones that were shared with us, and sometimes we use the word like, It's like a box of chocolates, and sometimes we don't. So Juliet, yours happens to be on the screen. I'm in a beehive, working hard on the inside. So a metaphor is when we choose to describe something in terms of something else. And sort of cognitive linguists increasingly recognize that it's crucial to our ability to think complex thoughts. And if we're grappling with something that doesn't quite have a shape or form, then we will use a metaphor to give it one, to enable us then to process it and store it. So all those beautiful metaphors that you've shared with us are a way of us trying to put something that might feel slightly intangible or unclear into a concept that feels somehow clearer, and then we can begin to process it. So it's like, it is like this, a set of internal stories that we create. And I think the other thing to say, Damion, is they can become self-sustaining. Because we know the brain's designed to be energy efficient, once we've formed this metaphoric picture landscape way of thinking about it, it can stay in place until we take some time to explore it and give it some space that it might evolve.
Thanks, Liz. I suppose that's just bringing up for me just this piece around, the sense of, and I mean this metaphorically as well, but slowing the coachee's thinking down as we start to work with this phase of meaning that they're providing us when they start to use metaphoric languages, a language, and that sort of sense of the embodied sense that's there. So just say a bit more about how we might work with this as a coach then.
Yeah, so I think in a way, the key things are the things that we always do. So I would say is to just get curious, get curious and get interested in it and let it evolve. As with all aspects of any kind of deeper exploration where we're helping our coachee to perhaps surface or explore or grapple with something that's, in their more in their unconscious rather than in their conscious mind, we need to give it space and time. So the first thing is just to do what you all do, which is to, really hold that place of curiosity and space and it's like trust that it will evolve. And the other thing is to use the coachee's language, so as much as you can, because they will have chosen it for a very good reason. So really sort of supporting their exploration by using their own language. And this is why there's quite a link between sort of using metaphors and clean language. And I know, Damion, we've talked about doing a webinar on clean language, so we'll put that one into the diary as well. And so I think linked to that is sort of asking some really simple, clean questions can really be helpful. So we've included some just here on the slide. So I think my learning around metaphor is, really less is more when someone's in an exploration where they're really beginning to describe the richness of this sort of metaphoric landscape. So I had a coachee recently who was talking about being at a crossroads and also trying to find her path. And so we started to model it. You'd be surprised to hear, with a bit of standing up and moving around. And I remember asking her just a question, which is, and what's the relationship between the crossroads and the path? And again, it's just a really simple question that, suddenly it can start to evolve. And she then started talking about, the path was some way away and there was grass between her and the path. So then we can just, so say some more about the grass, and whereabouts is the grass? And when the grass grows, grass keeps growing. And when the grass keeps growing, what happens to the path? So a lot of the language we can use is really helping someone explore how these things are connected. What's the impact of each on the other? And a really good, so the question that you can use to help someone evoke a metaphor is, if someone's talking about it, is just to ask, and that's like what? And it's a very specific question. And it's very different to the question, what's that like? So what's that like is much more likely to get a cognitive answer, whereas that's like what is much more likely to evoke a metaphoric or some metaphoric language. So ask some simple, clean questions. Please don't feel you have to know these. You certainly don't. But, you know, that real sense of less is more. And the other thing I would say is don't rush. You know, you will know if your coachee is valuing the exploration, because they will get somewhat lost in it. Actually, you really do see that. And so take your time. One of the other sort of, you know, this work is also rooted in developmental psychology, and that presumes that growth is a natural occurrence. And so in other words, if you hold the space for someone, they will grow. Just the last tip I would say, actually, Damion, is that when someone's exploring a metaphor, so whether they're recalling a memory or talking about what might happen, what's important is that actually, as we're helping them model it, we're doing it as if it's now. So the language is the language of the present. Because there's also something about, if I can help the coachee model it now in the room with me, I'm really supporting the possibility that it will shift. And you and I know, people who work with us know, that's true of a lot of the tools and creative ways we encourage people to work, that actually getting someone to say it in the moment or experience in the moment is a really powerful way of connecting them to it. And of course, the other thing is we can also really embody it. You know, we can encourage people to get up and move around and really embody, what does it feel like? So Michelle, what does it feel like to be a bear, you know, in lethargy, waiting for going out? So we can really sort of help our coaches connect to their embodied sense of this as well.
I thought this is quite an important piece, Liz, so I just wanted to move you on to just talk. I know you said about using the coachee's language, and that sort of next bit around this, around us bracketing the assumptions we're making as we hear the metaphor. So how about just saying a bit about this?
Yeah, it's a great point. And so you and I have shared a couple of examples here that we've experienced. So a couple of things I'd say, actually. So what happens with metaphors is that a lot of them have become part of our everyday language, and we've seen some of them in the chat panel. So, you know, a couple of you have used the word roller coaster. Tossed at sea, I think, is another one that I've seen. So what happens is they become a little bit of a shared vocabulary for all of us, which is great. But we also have to remember that even though we think we're sharing it, we all see the world differently. And so even when we think we're using a common metaphor, we have to realize that we will have our own interpretation of it, and that the experience that sits underneath that for us will be different. So my understanding of tossed at sea will be very different to, so I've lost them, I'm not sure who shared that, but whoever shared that metaphor. So one of the most important things when working with someone else's metaphor is really to not layer on our own interpretation, and to be very mindful. So I'll come back to when we might share our own metaphor, but to be mindful of when or intentional if we're doing it. So I love your example here, Damion. You know, it's like the CEO saying it's like the biggest oil tank you've ever seen. And then that sort of offer of how are you steering the ship, and his answer, I'm not, I'm on a tugboat trying to get a line on board. So again, we can make assumptions about where the CEO is. And of course, he's, you know, metaphorically, he's in a different place. And then the other one about the line in the sand, this was a big learning point for me around metaphor. And I assumed it was such a positive thing for my coachee. And so I did say that sounds positive, how can you move forward? And then she said, no, I've drawn it with my finger and the tide's about to come in and wash it away. And, you know, the impact of that on me was huge. So it's a really important thing to just stay with their experience and not, you know, be mindful about not layering on your own. And to your point, Damion, of course, there are times when we might be experiencing an image or a metaphor, and, you know, that can be really useful to share too. And it's just important that we contract around doing it. So we might say, look, as you're talking, I noticed that I've got an image in my head, or, you know, I've got a metaphor going on. How do you feel about me sharing it? And then you can share it. Of course, that might trigger something in the coachee. So of course we can share it, and we would encourage that sharing. But when someone's really lost in their own metaphoric language or landscape, I'd really work with their language.
And so, because we're talking about potential challenges, what other things would you say, or challenges might a coach have to be aware of, Liz, in terms of doing this work?
So I think as with all creative techniques, Damion, what we sometimes experience is almost trusting it. Because if we're slightly hesitant as the coach that, am I adding value? Is this working? How helpful is this? Then we might not, really sort of fully go into it with someone. So I think there's something just about understanding our own relationship to it, and being prepared to experiment with it and just try it and have a go with it. And I suppose the other piece is that piece around just, the emergent nature of it. So it may not necessarily be obvious at that moment in time what shift has happened. Sometimes it is, but not always. So I think there's something also about just trusting that the shift may take place outside the coaching session, which of course is always the challenge with any of the work that we're doing. And I'm curious, Damion, whether you, from your experience, there are any other challenges that you would draw out.
So I think you've touched on them, Liz. Me, it's really around not rushing it. So often if we're talking about beyond words, because the coachee is using a metaphor to describe something that they may be having difficulty with, finding the words as a sense of giving them space, really helping them evoke the metaphor in terms of whether they're seeing it or feeling it, before we start to sort of ask questions about it. So I think that's the key one for me. And I'm just, often I'll say things to my coachee like, I'm really trying to see this in my own mind. So just describe a bit more about what you're seeing or hearing, depending on the language they're using.
Yeah, actually, that just does remind me, I think as you're saying, Damion, so for some people, some of our coaches, their language would be incredibly rich in metaphor. And for others, they may not sort of think, or their language may not be so peppered with metaphor. And so really we just work with whatever's there. There are a lot of metaphors that actually are more subtle in our language. So, for example, that was a cutting remark. Well, actually cutting is still a metaphor. So I think the other challenge is not everybody, as I said, does sort of come up with these really rich metaphors, and that's okay. We're all different. So you can always work with what's there. So Nora, you ask a lovely question. When do we know to stop referring to the metaphor in the coaching session? It's a great question. For me, as with all of these ways of working at a deeper level, I'm sort of managing the time. So sometimes you just have a sense that the coachee has got to where they need to go with it. So there's a bit of just trusting your instinct and also checking in with them, how helpful it is. And also, if you're working with someone for perhaps an hour, it's leaving time at the end to bring them out of that exploration, to then, if you like, bring them more into their, conscious cognitive brain, to then work out what they're going to do with that. So it's that, we often draw a sort of U shape of taking someone into, a bit of a deep dive and then bringing them out at the end. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add, and often, Nora, for me, there's that sense of, if this is about change, having time to evoke, if it would support the coachee, a metaphor around what they do want, and having time to really bring that to life as well. So Liz, talking about managing time, I'm conscious we've probably got a few minutes left. So let's just perhaps share some thoughts around, we've spoken about challenges. So what are the benefits to actually, working with metaphors? And then we'll see if we've got time for questions. But
okay, so I think very quickly, Damion, because I think I've said these things. So I think one of the benefits is it really helps someone convey their own meaning. So, and I think someone put in the chat panel, can help us convey things that are quite difficult otherwise to talk about. And also, if we stay with their language, it's sort of free of the other distracting interpretations or emotions of someone else. So it also creates these conditions for internal mind wandering, which makes it more likely that insight will occur rather than necessarily focusing directly on the problem. I think for us as coaches, it builds our ability to listen at a deeper level, you know, and to really sort of tune into what's being spoken and not spoken, and to really stay non-judgmental, you know, by not interpreting it. And the other thing I would say for the coachee is it can be a real anchoring experience. People generally remember any experience they've had of exploring a metaphor when they've gone quite deep with it. So I can certainly remember a few that I've had in the past. So it's a very anchoring, sort of memorable way of working with someone. And by memorable, I mean not just because we want to remember it, but because it really sort of supports someone making that shift, that transition.
So Liz, just what would you like to say? Just final thoughts, really, and then we'll see if we've got time to answer any of the questions that are coming in.
So I think final thoughts, you know, remember you don't have to fix it, just let it emerge. You know, use some of those clean language questions, don't rush. If your coach is not using metaphorical language, work with the language they're using. Enjoy, have fun with it. You know, we can really sort of play with these things. So, and just start to notice when you're using metaphorical language yourself, because it helps you tune into when other people are using it too.
Thanks, Liz. Thank you. And we're just there's a couple of other things I just want to say, but just because I'm conscious we've literally got a minute or so, but you know, picking up on the first question around, you know, are generally people more visual who use metaphors rather than, for example, people who are more auditory? I just wonder what views you've got of that.
I'm not sure I've done enough sort of a study to know that. I mean, I think my experience of it is, you know, potentially if someone was more auditory, you might hear that in their metaphor. You know, so in their metaphoric landscape, they just might describe more sounds or you know, more of what they can hear around them. So and again, it's that, for me, it's just about noticing what assumptions we might make about it. And my invitation, just be curious, you know, be curious about what your coachee is, what comes to mind when you ask them, you know, and that's like what, just see what happens.
Thanks, Liz. I agree. I think very much, you know, just they may not see the metaphor, they might be hearing it, is what I would say. So again, you'll definitely hear that in their language. How about any experience of using metaphors in groups? This will be the final question, and then we'll start moving things to a close, Liz.
Yeah, I can't say I've ever actually explicitly done it as an exercise with a group, but I absolutely would think it would be a lovely exercise to do. You know, I do have a very good friend who gets people to draw their sort of experience of being in the group. He has a huge piece of paper and everybody gets up and draws the journey. And that's, I mean, in a way, that's a sort of, it's not a metaphor, but it is a way of sort of trying to creatively get meaning, you know, get this sense of meaning out. So I would love to hear of anybody's experiences of explicitly doing it with the group. I think that would be fabulous.
Yeah, I just add, Ruth, you know, my experience is usually using metaphors as a group and drawing something from it. So, you know, if this team were in a swimming pool, you know, where would everyone be? And actually the team draw themselves in relationship to the swimming pool, etc. So we're running out of time. So thanks to everyone for joining in today. You know, I hope there's some useful thoughts for you to take away and reflect on your own coaching practice. You know, thanks, Liz, for your input in the session. And just to say that our next webinar is on the 16th of November at 1 o'clock UK time. And myself, Liz, and our colleague Monica Ross are going to be discussing this whole concept of self as instrument and actually how do we develop this capacity as coaches. So thanks again for dialing in and look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.